So let's maybe begin with the most famous source in Chanukah, which is Tana Rabbanan, top right, Mitzvahs Chanukah Ner Ishu Beito. The mitzvah of Chanukah is a candle, or really it means a light, because you could light with with oil as well. As in fact, it's preferable according to many. Ner Ishu Beito, a light, a man and his home. Okay, so you really need a home in order to light a Chanukiah. If you're on a journey, you're actually not obligated to light a Chanukiah. I think Rashi in Masechet Shabbat brings that if you're on a boat, you're not obligated to light. Probably the same thing is true about a train and a plane. You need a home in order to be obligated in this mitzvah. Mahadrin is a candle for each person in the home. Mahadrin, mina mahadrin, Beit Shammai omrim yom rishon madlik shmona mikam va'elach pochet v'holech, uBeit Hillel omrim yom rishon madlik achat mikam va'elach mosif v'holech. So there's the mahadrin, mina mahadrin, is Beit Shammai says you subtract, you start from 8, you go down to 1. Beit Hillel says you go up from 1 to 8. But what's interesting about this is we have a concept in halacha of hidur mitzvah, which means to beautify a mitzvah. Generally, if you have an object, you want to beautify the object. You want to make more beautiful tefillin, let's say, or Shabbat candles, more beautiful Shabbat candles. You could put them in a beautiful leichter, silver leichter, right? We want to beautify the mitzvahs that we do. According to halach, you only need 1 candle on Shabbat, so we put 2, connected Shama v'Zachar. So again, what we're doing is beautifying the mitzvah by adding another candle on Shabbat as well. And then you have Mahadrim and a Mahadrin, which is interesting because you don't find that anywhere else except on chickens. Right? In Israel, all the chickens say Mahadrim min a Mahadrin. But in halacha, this is the only place in all of the Shas that you have the concept of Mahadrin min a Mahadrin. The beautiful of the beautiful, even more beautiful, right? In which you either add candles or subtract candles. But the question, of course, is why by Chanukah do we, number one, do we stress the home, that you need a home? Because in essence, I mean, Chanukah has nothing to do with our home. It had a lot to do with what? It had a lot to do with the Beit HaMikdash. It had a lot to do with the Jewish people fighting wars and purifying and sanctifying the Beit HaMikdash. So why all of a sudden, when we purified the Beit HaMikdash and this miracle happened, right, we didn't light a Chanukiah in the Beit HaMikdash, right? And even today in shuls, we do light, even though I have to say that in America and in Canada, they're not davening so much in shuls, so you probably won't light in the shul. But when you light in the shul, it's only a minhag. The idea of lighting a shul, I would think, should be like the big idea, because a shul is like a Migdash Ma'at. It's like our Beit HaMikdash today. So we should really light the candles there and not in the home. And the opposite is true. The main place to light it is in your home. And there's a minhag to light in a shul. If you daven there, there's a minhag to light in a shul as well. So why is the home so important when the miracle happened in the Beit HaMikdash? The miracle was the wars. And the second thing is, why are we stressing Mahadrim min a Mahadrin on Chanukah more than anywhere else? I mean, anywhere else we have, beautiful, anytime we have an object, you can have a beautiful lulav etrog. You can have very muhudar matzot. The way you make the matzot could be very beautiful. Sometimes it's not necessarily the physical beauty, but it's a higher level in spirituality, a higher level of kedusha, because you had more stringencies on the matzah, let's say. So why by Chanukah is there's this concept that only exists on Israeli chickens, Mahadrin min a Mahadrin, right? Maybe in Australia as well as South Africa, United States, they also have chickens that are Mahadrin min a Mahadrin. But in Israel, on all the chickens, it says that. That's why you can't really assume that it's true. And then we have another Gemara that's very interesting right below it. Tana Rabbanan. The rabbis taught a braita, Ner Chanukah mitzvah nichal petach beito mibachutz. The mitzvah of Ner Chanukah is to place it on the opening of the home, right? Which means the door of the home, the petach, mibachutz, outside. Okay, the mitzvah is not to place it on the petach inside, outside, for obvious reasons, in order to pronounce the miracle, to show the miracle to everybody. But why dafka on the petach beta? Why can't you put it outside on the lawn? Get nice size menorah and put it on the lawn if you have a one-family home. All right, why is the petach beta so significant in Hanukkah? Again, we see the bayit is important, and here we begin to see not only that the bayit is important in lighting, but where you light, the bayit plays a very, very important role. It has to be mamash on the petach beta. It can't even be removed more than a certain amount from the petach, or else it doesn't look like it's your home that's being represented there. But it has to be al petach beta. Okay, so let's talk about how number one, how Hanukkah became the home became so important on Hanukkah, right? And how Mahadrim and Mahadrim became so important on Hanukkah. Let's talk about those two issues. So let's begin with maybe Mahadrim and Mahadrim. Now let's start, so to speak, from the beginning of Chumash almost. We'll start from Parshat Noach, where we're introduced to the father of Yavan, of the Greeks, right? Yavan of the Greeks. The father of Yavan was Yefet, okay? So let's maybe begin. You know, there's a very famous story in after the Mabul, which Yefet, Shem, and Ham, and Noach and their families survived. Then there's a story afterwards when Noach becomes drunk and embarrasses himself, laying in a tent, undressed, and something interesting happens. Ham goes out to his brothers, and he tells them, and in fact it says, "Vayaged l'shnei achav bachutz." He told both his brothers outside. He went outside to tell his brothers, and then I have it underlined where you begin on number 2. Vayikach Shem vayefet, and Shem and Yefet took it as simla. They took the garment, vayasimu al Shem shnehem, and he put it on the shoulders. They put it on the shoulders of themselves. Okay, vayelcho achoranit. They went backwards, meaning they didn't want to look at their father's nakedness. Vayechasu et ervad avim upneim achoranit ervad avim lo reu. They didn't see their father. They put the simla, or the blanket, on their backs, and they just threw it over their father without looking at their father. So that was a certain amount of kavod they showed Noach, who was actually a very great person, it seems. He was a tzaddik kaya b'dorotav, etel kimet alech Noach, but at this point he lost something. He lost himself in maybe, going through a major tragedy, world tragedy, and he became drunk, and the sons wanted in some way to cover that up without embarrassing their father. Interesting, the text says, Vayikach Shem Vayefet. Okay, let's learn up a pasuk Chumash. Somebody actually just said before, I think maybe Mary said that I taught her Rashi. So let's learn through another Rashi and see what Rashi says. Is Vayikach Shem Vayefet means, and he took, right? It doesn't say Vayikhu Shem Vayefet, Vayikach Shem Vayefet. So there's different ways to learn this, but if we take a look at Rashi, number 3, Vayikach Shem Vayefet, Ein ktiv kan Vayikhu. It doesn't say Vayikhu. Ela Vayikach. It says Vayikach, he took. Limed al Shem shenit ametz the mitzvah yoter miyefet. It comes to teach us that Shem was stronger about the mitzvah. He worked harder to fulfill this mitzvah of kibbutz v'ein and covering his father more than Yefet. That's why it starts by saying Vayikach Shem vayefet. First Shem took, and then Yefet was the addition, so to speak. He added to what Shem did, and he took the blanket as well. Okay, so what is Rashi really trying to say over here? That it says Vayikach Shem first to tell us that he was stronger about the mitzvah. Does it mean just a question of of um, uh, of one did something more than the other, quantity, or doing it first is something that relates to quality as well. The quality of his mitzvah was different, and here Rev Soloveitchik learns up the Rashi in a very beautiful way. And we're going to see that shortly, that Rev Soloveitchik has a very interesting idea about this Rashi. But I'd like to just take a look maybe for a second at 4. It's almost like parenthetic, but it'll sort of help us. Because when Noach gives a bracha to Shem and Yefet, he gives a klala, he gives a curse, he curses Cham, but he gives a bracha to Shem and Yefet, which is very interesting. The Yefet bracha is strange. And that's a little bit further down, right before the end of 2. It says, Yaftelokim liyefet v'yishkom bo l'shem. God will beautify that which is to Yefet, and it will dwell in the tents of Shem. Okay? So he talks about Yefet and beautiful, because Yefet, the word Yefet means to beautify, right? Yefat Toah, right? A beautiful woman, right? Which we'll discuss a little bit later. But Yefet is from the word Yafa. So Yaftelokim liyefet v'yishkam bo Shem. It will dwell, this beauty will dwell in the tents of Shem, which is very interesting. There seems to be like sort of a combination here, since they both did the mitzvah. And the Gemara says, there's a Mishnah that says actually that it makes a difference la halacha. Okay? In number 4, it says, Ein bein tzvarim l'tfilin u'mezuzot. There's no difference between a Sefer Torah and tfilin and mezuzot. Ela shasvarim nichtavim b'chol lashon. Sifrei Torah are written in any language, and they have holiness. Utfilin and mezuzot ein nichtavim ela shurit. And tfilin and mezuzot are only written in the Hebrew language, and the ktav, the writing has to be ashurit. That's the writing that we have today. It's not the old ktav ivri that they had in the first temple period. They have to have ktav ashurit. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel Omer af bisfarim lo itiru sheikotvu el yavanit. Even in Sifrei Torah, you can't write it in any language, but you can write it in Greek. Okay, and the Gemara below says, Amar Reb Abo, Amar Reb Yochanan, halachic Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. The law is like Reb Shimon ben Gamliel that you can only write a Sefer Torah in Greek, in the Greek language, and in the Greek ktav, in the Greek writing. Now, why? My time Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, what was his reasoning? Amakra yaftel kim liyefet v'yishkan ba'olei shem. Dvarav shal yefet yu ba'olei shem. The matters of Yefet should be in the Olei Shem. So actually, this bracha that Noach gave to Yefet is changed to halacha. We're allowed to write a Sefer Torah in the Old Greek. I don't know if we still know what the Old Greek looks like, but in the Old Greek, which was a beautiful language and a beautiful ktav writing, you're allowed to write a Sefer Torah, and it gets the kedusha of Sefer Torah. Okay, so from this pasuk, we actually learn a halacha, right? It's a very big yesod that the beauty of Yefet has meaning when it's put into the tents of Shem. So let's try to understand this one step at a time. Number one, what is the difference between what Shem did and what Yefet did? So here Rav Soloveitchik actually says a very yesodi and beautiful idea. In number 6, Rav Soloveitchik says like this: Vanira loma bazeh. I want to say the following thing about the difference between Shem and Yefet, the fact that Shem took the lead in covering his father. I want to tell you what the difference is between Shem and Yefet. The base in Yonim Nifradim Heim. There are 2 separate ideas. Ha'etika, the etiquette. Of course, that's English, so that's why it's so hard to read, right? Etika, the etiquette, right? There's something we call ethics, and there's something we call etiquette, okay? Ha'etika mechayevet la'adam la'asot ha'tov v'yashar afil kushu beino levein atzmo. Ethics tells me to do the right thing, even when I'm all alone, okay? No, it's the fact that I have something that's ethical behavior. It doesn't matter if it's in front of somebody or not in front of somebody, right? You do it because it's the right thing to do. When they interviewed the woman who's the secretary in the building where Anne Frank was hiding with her family, she wouldn't tell the Germans. The Germans threatened her. They said, is there someone in this building? They threatened her. She wouldn't tell them. She said, I didn't tell them because it's the right thing to do, right? And that's why I wasn't afraid. It was the right thing to do, right? That doesn't matter whether you're with people, without people, whether, there are people watching or you're all by yourself. There are no other people around who can actually praise you when we talk about ethics. Even if there are people criticizing you, right, and threatening you, they are belittling you. If you have to daven and you're only in the street, right? That's ethical. That's something, davening is a chiyuv, right? So you stand up and you daven. Whether or not in Israel that's easy, maybe in Australia it's a bit harder, right? People may, call the police if you're talking to yourself, but it's the right thing to do. So it doesn't matter if people are watching and they're going to say there's a little bit of a nutty person there standing in the corner talking to themselves. It doesn't matter. Etiquette is a matter of beauty, right? It's like manners. It depends on different people at different times in different countries. I'm sure that Australia has different etiquette than the United States, than England, right? Than South Africa. Everybody has similar etiquettes in the Western world, but they have different ones as well. And certainly not in the Western world, there's a lot of tremendous amount of difference. So things change. Something that was etiquette 100 years ago may not be today, right? Medina la Medina, it changes from country to country. There's no obligation. Etiquette is not it's arbitrary, right? It's not objective. It's subjective to lands, to people, to times, right? So therefore, if you're not in front of anybody, right, etiquette will not obligate you to do anything. What is it? It has to do with honoring the creation. One should not belittle the other person. In other words, eating a steak with your hands, right, is not etiquette. It's not proper manners, right? But when nobody's home, it may not be a problem halachically to eat with your hands, right? This is not the quantitative difference, but the qualitative difference between shame and yefet. What does that mean? It means shame did it because it was the right thing to do. But yefet did it because shame did it. Very big difference, Rav Soloveitchik says. Okay? Shame did it because of an ethical reason that you have to have your father be beyond embarrassment. You're not allowed to have your father being embarrassed. Yefet did it because he saw shame did it. It doesn't look good if he doesn't do it. So you got to go along with it. And that's why yikach shame vayefet, right? And Rashi goes on to talk about each one got a different type of reward because of it. I'm not going to go into that right now, but that's what Rav Soloveitchik says. That yefet has the power of etiquette. Shame has the power of ethics. Okay, one is objective, one is subjective. Okay, and therefore, the Rav Soloveitchik goes on to say that Yefet did not get involved in the mitzvah because he thought that's something we have to do. He got involved because he saw that Shem did it, right? And he wanted Shem to look at him in a proper way, right? And this is really the yesod of Yavan versus Shem. Yavan has a tremendous amount, as we know. Yavan was very much into beauty, into the arts, right? Into music, right? All our Western culture of arts, music, sports, a lot of that is taken from the original seed of Yavan, of the Greeks, right? And when the Greeks took over Israel, they tried to implant in the country all these things. They made colosseums, right? And they spoke about the beauty of every human being, I mean, the beauty of man. They spoke about a beautiful person as opposed to a great person, right? Beauty was more important to them. Sports being the perfect, physique of the person and being a sports player or the arts were extremely important. And by the way, Judaism is not against that. They're not against this idea of the arts and the sports, being involved in that. The question is, does that become the goal? Meaning, is that what we were striving for etiquette, for beauty, for great music? Is that what a Jew like the Greeks has to strive for, right? That's what he strives for, right? Or no, it's secondary by us, right? And it has to be used in the proper way. If it becomes a goal unto itself, right? The idea of the Greek beauty becomes a goal unto itself, it can be very, very damaging. And the truth is, there Soloveitchik does talk about this in another place. He says, I actually think I have it here, yes. Rav Soloveitchik says, Yesha Yofi, you don't have this in front of you, but I'll read it for you. Sometimes Yofi ba meikra lechapot la'alim hafirut v'achzoriyut. Sometimes beauty comes in its essence, its original form, to hide something that is hefker and cruel, behemiyut, animalistic, okay? Hidarderut musarit, a very low level of musar. And he gives actually a very good example. He gives a number of examples. So one of the examples is that he says, V'chi lo slilei musica klasit shel Beethoven v'Schubert, hoyu malavin et tzadeim achronim shel achenu letoch hatei hagazim. Wasn't Schubert and Beethoven played when the Jews were being led into the gas chambers? They were playing, and you could actually hear this in newsreels, that in documentaries, they were playing classical music. So Soloveitchik says, what? Classical music was the beauty of the German community, the beauty of the music world, right? And what did they use it for? They use it for the lowest level, to hide the screams of the Jewish people. They're murdering Jews and playing Beethoven, right? Soloveitchik says, in one hand, there was a guy playing a violin, and with the other hand, he was killing Jews, right? And this is something that we have to be very careful, because when you have etiquette, the minute you have etiquette, it's never going to be objective truth. It's going to be relative to what's going on in the times. So the Germans can also do what they did, saying that, the Jews were a menace to society, right? So we could do this. But the fact that they included in that their beautiful, quote unquote, music tells you that you can use the etiquette and also the Greek culture in the most demonizing ways, the most animalistic ways. That's what Soloveitchik here is saying, is that by the Jews, the idea is first and foremost, is it true, right? Is it objectively true, not subjectively true, right? Um, my father used to tell the shul. I remember my father had a had a had a he always enjoyed telling the following story. I don't think it's a true story. I can't believe it's a true story, but he used it as a mashal, as a parable. He said two people from a very, very outstanding university in the United States went to do research in deepest and darkest Africa on the cannibal tribes. And two like scientists went, and they lived there for a number of months interviewing the cannibals who were, of course, they eat human flesh and stuff like this, and gaining knowledge to like what is their culture about, trying to understand their culture. And one of the professors had finished his work and he left, and the other professor said, I still have some more work to do. I'm going to stick around for a number of months. But a couple of years passed and the other professor doesn't come back. And the first fellow, the first scientist feels, he's going to go back there with a group to try to get the fellow out of there if he's still alive. Maybe they had him for dinner during, one of those months, right? So, so he goes back to Africa and he asks the cannibals that he visited where his friend is. And the friend, and they say, what do you mean, where's your friend? He's the head of our tribe now. So they said, what? He's the head of a cannibal man-eating tribe? And yes, they called him and he came out and he had his whole garb on. And he says, I don't get it. We did a research on, man-eating men, right? Cannibals. I mean, what happened over here? He says, well, I worked out the culture and everything, and I really understand where they're coming from today, right? So he says, but it's so primitive. He says, no, it's not primitive. He says, now when we eat people, we use forks and knives. So it's not primitive anymore, right? That's the primary example. That's the Germans. That was the Nazis, right? Eating people, but using forks and knives because you have the etiquette. You just don't stop eating a human being. You have etiquette, right? That's the idea that my father wanted to bring out, that if you have the etiquette without the ethic, you get into deep trouble. And that's why we're saying the Yaftal Kimli Yefes Yishkam Bole Shame. Yefes's beauty is legitimate, right? But it has to be in the Ohole Shame. It has to be to be really beautiful, to be Muhudar, it has to be in the Ohole Shame. It has to be connected with something holy. Else what happens is it could become the lowest level in the world. And we know how low, we can have great actors and actresses and very talented people. Of course, the actors actually can be very talented, but they're very low because the acting is not the means to a goal, but it's the goal itself. And therefore, or they begin to think that they're God themselves, like the Greeks. Beauty was God, so to speak, right? That was what they worshiped, right? So we worship the actors and actresses, and they worship themselves as well. And that's extremely dangerous for many different reasons I'm not going to go into right now, but that is the world of secular culture. And so Soloveitchik says we have to be very careful not to confuse, right? Culture which we're allowed to partake in, and the secular culture which is asur bechlet, it's prohibited to get involved in. And we'll talk maybe a little bit more about this soon. But the idea over here is that by Chanukah they made a mahadran min a mahadran. Why? Because they wanted to show that you could have. We believe in the most beautiful objects that you could possibly produce, but they all have to be within a mitzvah, right? So mahadran min a mahadran was an answer to the Greeks right? We're okay with beauty, but where do you put that beauty, right? Where do you put it? The Vilna Gaon writes that when it says Sheker HaHechein VeHevel HaYofi, when we talk about Eshet Chayil, he says Ishir Hashem. If the Ishir Hashem is connected with the Yofi and Chain, then of course it's very beautiful. It's really beautiful. But alone, it's Sheker HaChein VeHevel HaYofi. It's just transient. It's superficial. It's here today, it's gone tomorrow, except today we have good knives, so we get men and women under the knife. We have new ways of keeping them young. But the idea is that they're stressing the physical and the superficial and not the spiritual and the mental of the person, right? The real depth of the person, the nefesh of the person. It's all superficial. And that's why we say Hanukkah, we have Dafka Mahadrim and Mahadrim to show that you need to have the mitzvah connected with the Mahader, with the beauty. The word Hadar means beauty. That's one of the, most of the Rishonim understand Mahadrim as the language of beauty, a beautiful etrog, a beautiful having a Chanukiah and adding the candles, right? Making the mitzvah more beautiful than the simple mitzvah of Ner Ish Ubeito. But what is the idea of the bayit by Chanukah? And this is a very important idea. Chanukah historically changed the Jewish people. Okay, this we have a lot of times the center of Jewish culture, if we could say, right? A lot of times is connected with the shul, with the synagogue. In the conservative and reform movements, it's very common that most of the time, let's say the reform movement for sure, what they call a temple, they actually call it a temple, right? But it's their shul. They don't do very much at home. They can have non-kosher food at home, no Shabbos at home, but they go to the shul to, be Jewish in the shul. So the shul is a center of Jewish living for the conservative and reform movement. By us, it's not really so. And when did that change really come about, that our home became the center of Jewish living? And it makes perfect sense because at our home is where we live, right? The shul, we may go a lot, but we only visit it. But home, creating a home of Kedusha is where we live. Certainly if we have a family, but even if we're single, we're creating a home of Kedusha. That's what we're looking for. When did that start? When did that begin? Now let's take a look at number 5. And this is very interesting. Yossi ben Yoezer ish Tzreida, Yossi ben Yochanan ish Yerushalayim. Yossi ben Yoezer from Tzreida and Yossi ben Yochanan from Yerushalayim kiblu mehem. They got from the previous generations. Now, if you recall, Shimon HaTzadik, who lived the beginning of the Second Temple period, they're 2 generations from Shimon HaTzadik. Okay, this is the beginning of what we call the Zugot, two rabbis representing Israel as opposed to one. Why? According to some opinions, actually, because the Greeks started taking over the Beit HaMikdash. They took over the Kahuna Gedola. Many people became Hellenized amongst the Jewish people, and even the Kohen Gadol became Hellenized in many instances, and therefore they now had to be represented. The Jewish people who were traditional still had to be represented, and therefore they had, one was the Av Beit Din, and one was the Nasi, the spokesman for the Jewish people, meaning the Prushim, the ones who were completely loyal to God. So it says like this, Yossi ben Yezer Omer Beitcha Beitvad LaChachamim. Your home should also be a meeting place for the rabbis, for wisdom. Chacham, the people who have wisdom. Not only should it be the place, but you should sit by their feet, you should roll in the dust of their feet and drink with sama, means with thirst, their words. Okay, this is very interesting. When did Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yochanan live? They lived in the period when the Greeks started ruling Israel. Okay, And Yossi ben Yoezer was actually killed by a Hellenized Jew. He was killed by his nephew, who was a Hellenized Jew, for remaining loyal, because the Greeks made also the decrees upon the Jews, as we know for Hanukkah. And before the battles began, Jews were dying because they weren't willing to give up their religion. Yossi ben Yochanan, Ish Yerushalayim, Omer, Hi beitcha pasuch l'ravacha, v'yu aniyim b'nei beisecha. It says, Yossi ben Yochanan says also, your home should be open wide to let people in. Chesed, right? Aniyim should be part of your household, right? Take a look that both these people are dealing with the Jewish home. The Jewish home has to be a place of wisdom and a place of chesed, a place of kindness. Why all of a sudden are they talking about this, right? Why all of a sudden are they speaking about the home? Rav Shimon HaTzadik said, on three things the world stands, right? HaTorah, Avoda, Gemilut Chasadim. 2 generations before, that's what he says. All of a sudden here, we're dealing with Torah, the rabbis, right? Inviting them into your home, and Gemilut Chasadim, Yehi Beitcha Patuach L'Ravacha V'Evi Aniyim B'nei Beitecha. Avoda is not here anymore. Okay, why? Because the Greeks closed down the Avoda. They closed down the Beit HaMikdash. They defiled the Beit HaMikdash, right? So there was no Beit HaMikdash. So he said, you know what? Now let's make our homes a place for Torah and Chesed. Avoda right now is not happening, but let's talk about Torah and Chesed, and let's put it in our homes because it'll be safe in our homes. Outside, we can't do Torah because they won't allow it. We can't do Chesed because that wasn't part of their agenda. Let's do it in our homes. Here's where the big change in history took place between amongst the Jewish people. That the Beit HaMikdash was not anymore the center of Jewish life. The center of Jewish life began being for Torah and Chesed, Torah Chaim v'Avat Chesed. It began being in the home. Okay, this is what was important, and therefore, okay, the Ner Chanukah represented more than the Beit HaMikdash. It represented the Jewish home. What does that mean? It was telling us that Ner Ishu Beito, right? The home, right, has to be protected, right? In other words, there's culture outside in Jerusalem, in the rest of Eretz Yisrael where the Jews lived, but the home has to be protected. And Rav Soloveitchik says something very beautiful about this in a completely different article, right, than the one I read you before. He says something very beautiful. He says that, you know, we tend to allow culture into our homes, especially today with our internet. It's hard to keep culture out of the home. It's a very big challenge, right? But even before that, we had televisions and we had music, secular music, and we brought these things into our homes. Rav Soloveitchik has a beautiful idea on the Eshet Yifat Torah. If you recall, that there was a woman who a soldier captured in war, and he was struck by her beauty. Okay, and Rav Soloveitchik always talks about this idea of, you know, being very careful that if you're taking the culture of the idea of beauty, which we see in the Torah is important, and we see that the Jewish people do a lot of, they build a beautiful shul, right? They're into beautiful architecture and stuff like that. He says you have to be very careful not to trade off, right? A deep beauty for a superficial beauty, which he calls, I think he calls it a, let me see if I have the line over here. Yeah, he calls it a barak. He says it's a barak. It's a lightning beauty, right? It's superficial that you see just from the outside. And he says a Jew should never confuse the two. Okay? Um, yeah, let's see if I can find the sentence where he says it. Um, here. El tzorach lizaher shelo lachlif et hayofi v'ap'er atzarufa atahor shel yefet ba'oto habarak hachitzoni shelo shetocho ein el bahimiyut hefkerut v'tuma musarit. Okay, one has to. Oh, it actually have it right over here, right in the number 7. El tzorach lizaher shelo lachlif et hayofi v'ap'er atzarufa atahor shel yefet. Don't confuse the pure beauty, the correct beauty that Yefet had and we're allowed to use with that beauty that he has called Habarak HaChitzoni, the superficial lightning striking. Shetocha eino behemiyut hefkerut v'tumat musarit. Ki teitzei la milchama aloivecha unesanu al Hashem Elokecha biyadecha v'shavita shivyo. You remember the story. He's struck by the stricken by the beauty of this woman, and he wants her. So what do you have to do? When in the future, the Torah is saying, when you're in war with Canaan, Paras, Yavan, Romi, Ashkenaz is Germany. But Vade Tiglebahem Yofi. You'll see beauty in, you go to museums or you go to beautiful buildings in Western Europe, right? In Italy, in Rome, in Germany. Hayofi Shabbatarbut Afilu Shala Oyev Mutar Ba'ana. You're allowed to bring that into your homes, that beauty. Avo mazhircha ani. I'm warning you. The Torah is saying, "Sha'al tita'ech halil b'yafat toar hen kipshute v'hen k'moshel yofyev shel otu tarbut." He says, Yafat toar is more than just a woman. It's the whole beautiful Western culture. And he says you have to be very careful. The outside is not like the inside. Look at it very beautiful. Very, not beautiful, but very carefully. Do you want to bring this into your home that it should beautify and make graceful one in truth one's home? Maybe what you're bringing into your house here is more than you can handle. It's only a superficial lightning striking you. Kahut vach zoriyut. V'gilchas rosha v'asta tziparnel. Shave off her hair. Let her grow her nails. Tzorach ata lizaher sheyafya chitzoni lo yisanver, lo yisabech otcha. What does it mean? Ve'siret simlat shivyam ela. What did this woman come into the house? She was gorgeous. Why? Because she was dressed beautifully, because her hair was beautiful, because her nails were beautiful, right? Cut that all off. Take off that dress and put her in something that's, a regular dress, not the beautiful dress she went out to seduce you with, right? What is Rav Soloveitchik saying? Go past the superficial beauty of this woman. Do you still want her when you don't see her being beautiful? When you see how she really is, maybe she's an achazor, maybe she's part of the achazoriyut of that nation, right? Is this what you really want? So what is Rav Soloveitchik saying is that more than just a halacha, Yifat Toar, the whole parsha Yifat Toar is a mashal for the tarbut, the Western culture that we're bringing into our homes. And you have to take apart that culture and see, is it healthy? or is it unhealthy for us, right? And that's what it means when you take off her dress and you shave her head. You get rid of all that outer beauty, and let's see what that culture is really about. And if there's a problem with that Disney movie, we don't bring it into the house. If there's no problem, we do bring it into the house, right? In other words, that's part of Western culture is even the movies that, kids watch, right? We have to know what the ramifications of some of those movies are for the kids. What are they putting into their heads, right? So even if we can find a show or a movie that's proper for the kids, right? And that's why we invented, things like Marvelous Midos Machine. I don't know, all these like different um, Jewish movies, because people were afraid that they're bringing in culture that they don't know what the ramifications of that culture is. And that's why, coming back to Hanukkah, we're saying that the the essence of the mitzvah of Hanukkah is ner ish ubeito lanichal petach beito mibachutz. Where do you put the menorah? If you're lighting outside, you put it right on the doorway. Meaning what? Separating the outside from the inside. Right? The outside is that's what the culture is going on out there. But I don't let it into my home. There I have a Chanukiah that lights up, right? That lights up the Kedushat Habayit, the holiness of the home. And I now go through with a fine-tooth comb, right? With a microscope, whether what I'm letting into my home is the proper thing. So I have the mezuzah on one side, which represents they say the physical safety of the home, and you have the Chanukiah on the other side of the door, representing the spiritual side of the home, right? Safety in the spiritual side, and the dafka outside, mibachutz, because inside the Chanukiah doesn't do much. Outside, it professes and it announces the miracle, but it also says this home is a holy home. Before you come in, you have to first test it by the light of Hanukkah, by the light of Kedusha Taner of Hanukkah, right? Which was God's way of reigniting in us Kedushat Hamakom, Kedushat Habayit, right? And that's what happened. The home became the center. And therefore, even though it happened in the Beit HaMikdash, right, the idea of putting it in the home meant we can't get rid of the culture outside. The Greeks already influenced the Jewish people. They had a certain amount of influence on the Jewish people, but inside, we don't let it into our home. Our home became the center of our chokhmah, of our chesed, right? As opposed to the Beit HaMikdash or today, the shul, which is very important for us, but it's nothing like the home. The home is the most important, the center of our Jewish growth, the center of creating a home. Because like Rav Soloveitchik said, ethics means you do it even in the home. Etiquette means you do it in the restaurant, right? When you're in the restaurant, then you have to do etiquette. You have to make sure you're eating nice and you have the napkin on your lap, right? And and then if you don't eat nice, someone says, I can't take you anywhere. You see, I can't take you anywhere. Look what you do, right? Your French fries are all over the table, right? That's already etiquette. But ethic, Rav Soloveitchik says, that's in the home. That's when nobody sees, right? That's where the big difference happens. And a lot of times you'll find people who they look very religious outside the home, right? But inside the home, something very different is going on. And something very problematic is going on. And that's what Hanukkah is here to let us know, that, you know what? The thing that was protected by Hanukkah was the Jewish home, because outside the Jewish home, the Greeks took over the Beit HaMikdash. They took over the Jewish avodah that the Jewish people had in the time of Shimon HaTzadik. But the home, they couldn't touch the home. The home was that little secret piece of that Pach Shemen, right? That was the hidden Pach Shemen. That's our home. That's our hidden Pach Shemen. That's why we have the mitzvah dafka to put it on our doorway. And that's why I have a mitzvah. If it's not a home, you're not obligated, because the whole mitzvah was being pushed towards the home. And that's really the two ideas being stated here. There's mahadrim and mahadrin on Hanukkah, because we want to show that, yes, we do have the concept of beauty. And on Hanukkah, we were struggling against that concept, right? And therefore, we created a mahadrin min a mahadrin to say, yes, you can beautify and beautify, but it all has to be connected ba'olei shem. Yaftel kimel yefes ba'olei shem. It has to be in our homes. When we beautify the mitzvah, that's what we have to do. That's number one. Number two is that the home has to be pure. Our home has to be pure, and whatever you let in the home, Rav Soloveitchik says, it's like the Yifat Torah. Bring her into the home, but only after scrutinizing that she's much more than just a superficial, beautiful woman. Once you know that something beyond that, right, then of course you can bring her into home, you can marry her, and so on and so forth. But it needs a lot of scrutiny before you do that. And the same thing with our home today. The home, of course, today is under attack because of things like the internet, probably mostly because of the internet. And even if you have a filter, you still have to mahadrin, the filter is mahadrin. Mahadrin min a mahadrin is filtering out the filter, right? So that's what has to be done as well.